So frequently when I would bring things into Unity and I would start to unwrap my assets and put them into the scene, I would get all sorts of errors with the lighting, and I would get errors with the way the textures were hooked up. And so over the years, I started to learn various things about how to solve these basic problems. And we will start off with what are UVs. So when you have a 3D object, you can think about the polygons on the surface as being unwrappable. You can define where seams are. And for instance, this is the classic cube shape that you probably encountered in elementary school. You could cut out the shape from a flat piece of paper, fold it up, get out some tape, and you could make yourself a little box. This works. The reason this is important is because when you have an image texture, it will project that texture onto the faces of your shape as it is laid out on a surface. So UV has nothing to do with ultraviolet because X, Y, and Z were already used for the main three axes in the 3D viewport. The letters U and V were taken because they're close to the end of the alphabet, and those are used for the coordinates within your texture window. So it's just a way of using two other letters to clear up any confusion so that you're not saying X and Y. Let's keep going. So how are they unwrapped? UVs, this is not going to be a tutorial on how to unwrap them. It's really just the concept. The program will either, as you can see here, we have the classic Suzanne monkey head from Blender. This is one of the default objects that's in the program that you can use to test things out. This one was auto unwrapped. Just at Blender, as it comes, it has it unwrapped. The face, as you can see, has the ears out. You have disconnected pieces for the eyeballs. These are all called UV islands. And this is a pretty good example of unwrapping. These are laid out. They're pretty easy to see. They take up the whole square on the right. Here's a great example. This is a really low poly model of a Chinook. And you can see that what they did was they had, it's kind of dark, but they have a texture, a 2D picture of the helicopter texture, and they have unwrapped the polygons, and they are saying that wherever this polygon is laying on the texture, that's the picture that I want projected onto my object. And you can see that they have multiple islands. They've split it up, and these are arranged across the image. Now, on this image, we have a boat. You can see that they have unwrapped all of the objects and placed it onto one plane, and these all overlap in various ways. That can work in like a Blender or some other 3D program. You can overlap these shapes and you will get that projection. The problem comes when you start to take overlapped islands to Unity. Let's keep going. Here's a big red flag. If you have something like this, this is not good. So this is the kind of thing that you want to check early on when you're working with a model. And there's various methods for unwrapping UVs. That's another talk. The main idea is just to point out what is something to be very aware of, and this should make you very worried. Let's keep going. The reason that the UVs are important to unwrap well is because of light baking. So in Unity, we have it's a standard game engine. You bring in 3D models, you can bring in lights, it can calculate the light rays, it can calculate the shadows. But when you're in a room like this, for instance, let's say you make this in Unity, yes, you want some illumination for your objects that are, something's moving around in the room, you want to be able to see a shadow under it. But in general, a lot of the illumination on the walls does not have to be dynamic. So what we do is we bake it. We put in some lights that illuminate the walls, and we say, these are not real-time lights. Calculate how they hit the walls, change the textures to be a little bit brighter or have shadows on them to look like they're illuminated, and then just show a picture of this thing being lit, rather than actually calculating the light every single frame. And in this example, This is just a basic little road with a street light. And if I bring this into Unity and bake my spotlight, if I remove the spotlight and the light post and all that, the street will still have a pool of light on it because I told that street texture that it needs to take that light pool and actually make a picture of it and project it on top of its texture. Once you rebake, it'll disappear. So that's one way to sort of think about the way Unity is doing it. It's fakery. You know, you're trying to trick the eye and do as little calculation as possible and get the biggest effect for it. So let's see, I think I explained, yep, all right. This is a picture of a light map. It's kind of a mess. This is from a scene which I'll show later. It's a whole bunch of objects. They're all laid out. These are all their UVs. And all of these bright, splotchy, kind of pixelated bits, that is the light from the scene that's being calculated. And then Unity will just draw it on top of the objects. And right now, you can see that most of these are split up. But if you were to have two sides of an object, one being lit and one that's dark, but both of those overlap on your 2D texture, Unity is just trying to project light straight down or shadow straight down. And if you have two things, one that should be lit, one that should be shadow, it can't decide what to do. So what you end up having are artifacts. It's trying to give you both worlds. It's trying to give you a shadow, it's trying to give you light, and it just ends up overwriting itself as it goes through the light baking process. This is a simple still life that I set up, and I am going to point out a few of the UV errors. The reason I've chose this scene is because it was poorly unwrapped, and it causes issues, and it was a good example. So this jug, the one that's orange on the left, this is unwrapped on the right, and you can see that there is they pretty much took the jug and it's sort of opened up and laid out flat. The lower portion of it, the circular base and maybe the rim, are in the center, and those are just smacked straight on top of the unwrapped sides. And not only that, but the handle isn't separated out as its own island. It is also completely overlapped. Let's see, another one, this orange vase with the stripes on it, someone unwrapped it and then for some reason just did a cross, but it's not just two pieces that are crossing. There's the base and there's multiple sides. I think there's like 4 or 5 sides, and they're all stacked on top of each other. So that middle area where they all overlap, if Unity were trying to project light or darkness maps onto that texture, it would completely mess up. It would overwrite itself, and it would add all sorts of weird splotchy artifacts. And I'm going to show some examples of that in some upcoming images. Here's another jar, unwrapped poorly. Definitely not something you want to go for. This table, which I'm going to put my still life on, it looks okay, but once you start looking at these boards here, you can also see that in the middle, they have all sorts of polygons that are just stacked on top of each other. It's kind of shoved together. It's a mess, and that is going to cause some errors, especially right down the center of the table when we do some light baking. Legs, same story. You have all of the individual faces from each leg, instead of them being sort of like joined and folded out like a cardboard box, in this situation, they were all separated as individual pieces, like you cut every face off the box and just laid it out and then kind of slid them all on top of each other, like you're trying to organize it. And it's a mess. It's a mess. So here we go. At first, you're going to look at this and say, all right, it looks okay. You know, this is a sort of like a tavern scene. I have sort of that like nice orangish lighting, and it's not too shabby. This is just pure luck. We're looking at it from an angle where you don't immediately see the problems. But if you check out this jug in the back, the big one, you'll notice that there's a sort of a weird dark pattern on it. And it would maybe make sense if you had a wall with like mottled light and shadows shining through it. But as we start moving around the scene, this is what we have. So you can see that the jug, which we remember from the UV, was completely unwrapped and opened. It was, Unity tried to bake lights And as it was putting light on some areas, it was then like, okay, let me calculate the shadow area and project that, and it just overwrote it. So you end up with a lot of splotches. This is one of the most common things you will run into when you're baking scenes, baking your lighting in Unity, if you do not have your UVs separated out well. Let's go through a couple more. Splotches on the vase with the stripes. And it's a little hard to see, but the dark vase here in the foreground also has some odd light splotches on it. Underneath the table, check this out. We have very, very bizarre areas here, which, like I said, if there was like a wall with slats in it and bits of light shining through, maybe that would make sense. But that is not how I set up this scene. And so this is just it's just a problem. There's tons of artifacts. And you'll remember from the UVs that all of these individual faces were all kind of jumbled on top of each other. And that's what led to these kinds of errors. Top of the table, middle boards, completely in shadow. It shouldn't be like that. I didn't put anything to block the light up top. It's something that to a casual observer who's maybe not an artist, you just be like, yeah, whatever, looks fine. It's a table with some stuff on it. But to me, it destroys my soul. It's one of those things that it's just so glaring and oh, it gets me. So let's show, this is quick and dirty, but I'm just gonna show how the UVs could be fixed up to help remove some of these errors. And it's as simple as just separating out all of the islands so that none of the polygons in your UV texture view, which is on the right, are overlapping. So what I did here was I separated out the bottom, I separated out the rims and the top, and I took the handle and actually cut that off. Now, when you cut these apart in the UV view, it actually does nothing to your model. It is just a way for the program to help interpret the polygons when applying textures. Here's another one. Remember, it was just sort of two sides crossed over each other before. Well, in this case, separated it all out. And as we go through, separated this table. I took all the top and bottom board, or all the boards on top, and took all the faces and just laid them out so that none of them overlapped. And I did the same thing for the legs, just spread them. Now you might also think on the right, you're like, hey, but those go off the texture. Remember that the texture is actually being tiled infinitely. It just doesn't show it in that scene. So all of those legs that are to the left of the texture pattern are also still over top of the same looking piece of wood. Let's keep going. Here we go. I rebaked now after moving all those UV islands around so they don't overlap, and bam, we got rid of those giant artifacts on the jug. Definitely feels a lot better. The striped vase, you'll notice, actually kind of looks like a striped vase now. It doesn't have weird splotches. And same thing for the vase in the foreground. Let's go check this out. Bottom of the table is actually in shadow. We don't have those strange bright spots that we saw. You do, however, have, dun, 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 you'll see right here at the top, it's a little dim here, I apologize, but right there at the top, it's not correct. You see a little sliver of light. Unity is not perfect. Sometimes when there's geometry near each other, it will not calculate distances quite right, and it will actually illuminate a little bit. So this will happen frequently if you're in Unity and you make a floor and then you have a plane that you just sort of stick there as a wall. You will get light leakage underneath it sometimes, and it's just the engine. There are ways around it, but it takes time to sort of work with it and massage your scene to remove those kinds of artifacts. Here we go, the tabletop. You know, my soul feels good now. The boards are illuminated properly, and there's none of that strange shadowing. Let's see what we got. In Unity, there is a debug view called UV overlap. What it does is it shows you all the objects in the scene. If there's no UVs overlapping, everything's white. And you can see here on the left, we have the bad scene. Tons of UV overlap issues. That's what the gray and the red are showing. On the right, it's not perfect, but it's functional. That's the scene that I baked later after I moved my UVs around. You know, some of them weren't the best, and also there was a basket in the scene. No, I am not unwrapping that. It was horrifying. There were so many thousands of polygons. This was not an optimized scene at all. But in general, for the large objects, this worked. The UV overlap view is your friend. Definitely check it out. if you're doing the art side of things. It's up in the shoot. I was just showing this yesterday, but there's a drop down at the top. Like I said, not a tutorial on that. When you're exporting your FBXs from Blender, after you get your UVs set up, a very important thing to do is to make sure that your textures are packed into the FBX file. This is not hard to do. It is just something you have to know where to look. And I'm sure that maybe only like one person in here is using Blender. But the main idea is that you want to find in your 3D program of choice a place where you can copy the path to your textures. And in here I have it just listed 1 through 4. We have our path mode, which will change to copy. And let me go to the next slide. Boom. So what we're going to do is we're going to copy our textures, pack them in, and we're only going to take the selected objects from our scenes, and we're only going to take the mesh. FBX files will, by their nature, pack up every single thing in your scene. Pack up lights, cameras, all that. If you bring all that into Unity, it's kind of messy. You have to go back through, you have to pull things out of your FBX package. So that's another thing to make sure, down there at 3 and 4, is to make sure you're only bringing your meshes. It'll still pack the textures. Once you get into Unity, as a general practice, I like to extract my textures and my materials into their own folders. Texture is a 2D picture, image, PNG, JPEG, something like that. Whereas a material is the full shader. It's an algorithm that is taking those 2D images and it is using magic to fake a surface, to fake how shiny it is or how metallic it is, that sort of thing. It's color, it's, there's various other things. It's normal or it's bump map so that you can get the impression that there are scratches or divots on the surface. Let's keep going. Here's a slide just showing the difference between the textures and materials. So when this scene was made, I extracted all my textures. You have your, very easy to see, I got my kiwis, and we have the various images that were used to project onto some of the vases. This is going to be used in that UV view, and this is what will be projected onto the shapes, onto the polygons of the shapes, and then of course they're folded back up into a 3D object. Materials, on the other hand, are displayed like spheres. Usually you can have other display types, but this is the textures versus materials is one thing I just wanted to bring up because frequently people will interchange the words. I do it all the time. And I just want people to be clear that they are not the same thing, and I am wrong when I say that when I use the same word for both things. Frequently when you bring in your FBXs, you'll need to check and make sure that your materials come through correctly. One of the big issues that I run into is that everything looks good in Blender, everything's hooked up right, all the textures come through. I unwrap it in Unity, and 2 or 3 of the objects in the scene just have no materials attached. It's a very simple fix. You can just drag your material to the object. That's one way to do it. Another problem, though, is that sometimes the material itself doesn't have the proper image texture hooked up to it. In this scene, I made just some tile for a floor. I wanted to point out that the color map is usually going to come through okay. Sometimes you're going to have issues with your normal map. This purple image is going to be used to fake the indentations where the grout is between the tiles. And Unity really wants to know if it's a normal map or not when you're making objects. So another thing that you should do is go into your folder and you actually can click on your normal maps, and in the inspector you can choose the texture type. Default would be your normal images, but there is a normal dropdown, and that way Unity knows how to interpret it to give you the proper surface appearance. So, in review, very simple. Overlapping UVs, bad. Nice separated UVs, very good. Let's check some more stuff. Another important thing, when you're exporting your FBXs, make sure you're only taking your meshes, and make sure you're packing your textures in. If you're using Blender at all, this is the window you're going to see. And the most important thing to remember is at the top, make sure you set this to copy and click the little thing on the right to actually pack the textures in. Let's go. And also in review, I just wanted to show the scene again and show you that there is light at the end of the tunnel. Oh my, is that a pun? When you are light baking, you will run into these issues. And unfortunately, the only thing to do is to go back, fix your UVs, re-export, and do it all over again. It's kind of annoying, but it's one of those things that if you're aware of it from the beginning, you can avoid a lot of headache down the road. And with that, I conclude. Thank you. Yeah, what's up, dude?
I thought we showed Unity for a second, and we're like, yeah, and then drop down, and I thought it was going to be like, fix UV map. There's no such thing.
No, unfortunately, not as far as I know.
Okay.
There might be some plugins of some kind, but you would have to research that. Everything I've done has had to be manual.
So when you see those overlaps,
Mm-hmm.
we would call you and say, hey.
Yes, so like I said, this wasn't a tutorial on UV unwrapping, but there are many ways you can accomplish it in Blender or Maya. I don't know about Cinema 4D, it probably has it as well. There's a way that you can do an auto UV unwrap. It's not the best, but it's quick and dirty, and it does work. It'll separate everything out, and it'll keep it from overlapping. So in general, that's what I would shoot for, is if you're not gonna spend the time to really unwrap it beautifully, just do a quick, dirty UV unwrap or a smart auto project or something like that, and then bring it back. Yeah?
A tool that I use is not natively export out FBX.
Mm-hmm.
We seem to take this bet that GLTF is going to be used, but Unity doesn't take, is that right? Unity doesn't take GLTF in the way that it takes FBX, is that right?
As far as I know, it does take GLTF, but it's just that the GLTF file format is a little simpler. It's a little more streamlined. So some of the textures and the way you hook up your materials in your 3D program of choice might not come through the way you expect. GLTF just has a little bit more restrictions on how the textures end up being shown on the object. But as far as I know, it does come through. As a what?
It's a package.
It's a package? Cool, yeah.
With Blender, have you ever messed with UDIM textures? So you have multiple, instead of it's like instead of having the UVs outside of the box, you have multiple boxes and stuff to use there.
Oh yeah, I have not personally done that. In general, when I'm working on these projects, it's very fast. It's like, hey, let's get this done, let's get it in. So it's usually just like, okay, separate it out, and then bake those lights, and you're usually good to go. But no, that would probably be something for me to look into and check it out. All right. Yeah.
Yeah. So two things. One, you've ruined me because I see the texture, the poor light baking issue all the time.
Yes.
And now I know how to fix it, which means I have to add more work to my thing. Anyway, the only other question I have is, are there any limitations to the size of the UV map in terms of, or in the context of optimizations or memory footprints? Because if you have a complex, high fidelity mesh,
Mm-hmm.
and you have to unwrap that,
Yeah.
are there limitations on the size of the UV map?
No, the UV unwrapping is not actually, there's really no size to it. It's more just think about it as unwrapping them within a border. So really you're only limited by the amount of polys in the shape. So yeah, if you have a 1,000,000 poly object, you're gonna have a 1,000,000 poly unwrapped UV. They're pretty much one-to-one, but you're not gonna have an issue with there's no real sizing of the map. You'll run into issues with the size of the textures you're using. So, keep it small. That's my suggestion. Anything else? All right. It is time. Thank you very much for checking this out.